Hello, and welcome to Live from New Amsterdam, a joint project between the New Amsterdam Project at New York Historical Society and the New Netherland Institute in Albany, New York. I'm Deborah Hamer. I'm the director of the New Netherland Institute, and I'll be your host for today. The New Netherland Institute is an organization devoted to preserving, translating, digitizing, and making available Dutch documents from the 17th and 18th century in North America. And my guest today is Dr. Chelsea Teale. She's a lecturer in geography at Cal Poly Humboldt, and she's currently working on a book about climate in New Netherland. Welcome, Chelsea. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. You can hear me all right?
Yeah, perfectly. Crystal clear. Okay, so let's get into it. Can you tell us a little bit about the climate in the Netherlands in the 17th century? So what were the settlers who were coming over from the Netherlands used to, and then how was it different when they arrived in New Netherland, in the 1620s and beyond?
Sure, I'm not an expert in Northern European climate history, but I guess at first I would say let's think about it in terms of Northern Europe instead of the Dutch Republic, because so many people that came to New Netherland were not Dutch. So thinking more broadly, like Germany, France, Norway, Sweden, anything in Europe would have been different but similar to New Netherland in that the Little Ice Age, which spanned approximately like 1300 to mid 1800s or so, temperatures were depressed by maybe up to a degree Fahrenheit in the Northern Hemisphere. And so everybody would have been maybe a little chillier than they are today. But also storm activity was perhaps a little bit more extreme or irregular than today. But there would have been plenty of years where nothing remarkable happened, and then several years where things would have been pretty uncomfortable, volatile, that kind of thing. So I think people, based on what I've read, New Netherland documents, is that people compared New Netherland to home. A lot of people describe it as just like home. Maybe the summers were hotter and the winters were colder, but otherwise it was the same. Even people who did comment on the cold winters would talk about the cold northwesterly winds that brought the cold, and they didn't know what was inside North America, so they didn't know why those winds were cold. But a lot of people compared it to the northeasterly cold winds that affected the Dutch Republic. So a lot of these descriptions are just like, it's the same. We have 4 seasons. They might start and stop a bit more abruptly than at home, but they exist, and the winds are the same. And I have the impression that it wasn't so completely different in terms of like objectively sitting back and looking at it. The issue was they weren't expecting it to be like that based on the latitude. So think of Amsterdam in the Netherlands today is about 10 degrees of latitude farther north than New York City. And so if you look at a map and you're a European in the 1600s, you're thinking, wow, like this area is basically like central Spain. So that's great. And then arrive and find that it's absolutely not like central Spain. So it's more about like being surprised about the seasonality than that other things were different. There's Adrian van der Donk wrote a description of the colony and did write that it's the same, except maybe there are more tornadoes. So I have to look at what the original term was for tornadoes that he used, but even he said the storm frequency and the types of storms were the same. So I don't know that it was extremely different. It's just they didn't have the resources to buffer against it as in yeah.
I mean, that's a great point also about the fact that obviously lots of the people who were in New Netherland were not Dutch necessarily, so they were European, and they might have had different expectations. But also, we can throw in the fact that there's, obviously enslaved Africans who would have had completely different expectations about climate and what they were used to. So yes, I mean, I think it's important to open up that discussion that not everyone was coming with the same experiences of climate. But yeah, so that's very interesting, though, that that the weather is actually quite similar, but it's the similarity that's the surprise rather than the difference. So they're expecting it to be different, and then it is in fact it's similar. I wonder if you can say anything to to the issue of what, since they expected it to be more like Spain, which it's obviously not. How did they react to that, or how did they even develop that expectation that it would be like Spain, so that it would be warm? And what did they do? What were they thinking that followed? Like, were there any projects that were basically based on that assumption?
There was the expectation of growing certain types of crops, but based on the records that I've used, which are a lot of official government documents, so they're not a whole lot of correspondence or things where people talk about their day, which is where you would find more information about agriculture or other things. The colony was not like the Tidewater Chesapeake area where it was like, okay, tobacco. It was about the fur trade primarily. So even at a colony scale, plans for big agricultural pursuits is not in the records that I have. But yeah, people expected to be able to grow crops that were more suited to a warmer climate. But then on the other hand, there's plenty of records of people talking about how great their orchards are, and there's plenty of this and that, and I picked some peaches in October. So it's difficult to distinguish between what's propaganda and what.
Yes, especially since you referenced Adrian van der Duk's book. Obviously he's, for those who don't know, he's writing in the 1650s because he specifically wants to get people to come to New Netherlands. So there's no incentive to denigrate the climate or the agricultural possibilities of New Netherlands. So that we definitely do have to take those sources with a grain of salt to some extent.
And the opposite as well. In 1629 and then again in 1634, the West India Company wrote to the States General to complain about how horrible it was and how cold it is, and it's unprofitable, and it's snowy, and the winters are bad, and it's agriculturally unproductive, and please don't make us do this.
Oh, that's so funny. So the West India Company was basically trying to make an argument that it would be better to kind of abandon New Netherland and focus on other areas in that early period.
Yes, but it's probably an exaggeration. So it's
yeah.
On the other end, because peace was starting to be negotiated with essentially Spain, and West India Company was really making a lot of money by seizing Spanish ships and taking the goods off the cargo out of them. And if there was peace, that would be illegal. But when war was happening, that was a thing that they enjoyed doing. And so they didn't want to have to stop doing that. So I think that was probably an exaggeration also.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah. So depending on whether you're pro keeping the colony or opposed to keeping it, you might have different reporting about the weather. Yes. And the climate. Yeah, that's very interesting. I just want to mention before we continue that if you do have a question, feel free to drop it into the Q&A. We will have some time for questions, in the last 10 minutes of this discussion. So feel free to start using the Q&A feature at any time, and we'll get to those questions at the end. When the Dutch, or when these new settlers arrived in New Netherlands, they encountered indigenous peoples, obviously. Is there any evidence they discussed the climate with them or learned anything from them about how to adapt to the climate or anything like that?
I'm sure they did, but in the records that I have used, again, they're more like government scale. So there isn't anything about adapting at a top-down level, except for some directives to do some things to mitigate flooding in Manhattan. There really is not a ton of that. So I'm sure it happened on a case-by-case basis. For example, 1630s, talking about Mohawk Valley, the Iroquois would often not want to leave their villages in the wintertime. And the quote would be because sometimes the snow is the height of a man. So, there was conversation, but it's just not written down very thoroughly. But I have seen from other records from New England and also the Delaware area, where comments were made when like Massachusetts Bay froze over and Delaware River froze over, and the Delaware froze in one night to the thickness that could support, you know, a person walking across. And in both of those cases, there's anecdotes about how the Indigenous people had never seen that happen before in their lifetime. So there was definitely a conversation, just not recorded. And the other thing I would mention is from Canada, but this is later in the 1600s past Dutch control, and the French were being aggressive, and they had you know, Indigenous allies on both sides, and there was a lot of little separate records, but probably coming from the same source. All these thousands of pairs of snowshoes being made, and everyone was, you know, worried about that because it's a quicker, faster way to reach your destination. And so to be surprised at that and feel threatened would mean that perhaps they had not already on a broad scale adopted snowshoes. I'm not sure. And again, that's just like one note. So really lacking in that department. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that brings me to my next question, which is how do we even really know anything about the climate in New Netherland in this period at all?
I'll start with the written documents because I've mentioned them a couple of times. I did the bulk of my research using translated Dutch colonial documents that are, you know, if you want to visit them on paper, you would go to the New York State Library. There's a room housing the New Netherland Research Center, which has them all in print. The New York State Archives and Library have these things also scanned if you want to read originals, which is pretty difficult. Or if you can't go to beautiful downtown Albany, New York, you can also go to NNI's website and download PDF copies of the documents. But a lot of them are court records, like minutes of court proceedings. There's other rules, like regulatory sort of documents. There are some volumes of correspondence. One just was published, was it this year or last year? Volume 13.
Yeah, just a few months ago.
Yeah, 2023. So there is some correspondence, and that's where you get more details, like a person writing to their mother and saying how things are on the farm. But there is less of that than there is like people suing each other, which often doesn't have any reference to the weather. So there's plenty of that, but there are also proxy records, which are the archives of nature, if you want to think about it that way. That's how some people refer to them. They are things that nature makes that are left behind that then we can look at today and infer what the past was like. So the best example would be tree rings. Each ring represents 1 year of growth. So you can count back and get 1 year of information on a number of different variables, most commonly precipitation. And it's you could figure out like what year was dry and which year was moist. And it all depends on the tree and where you are. So there's a lot more detail involved, but on a general sense, you could reconstruct precipitation history using tree ring records. Similarly, if you get some sediment cores, like from a bog or a lake, even the ocean, drill down, it's not, drilling makes it sound dramatic, but you just get a tube of muck and you could figure out what pollen grains or bits of plants and other things like diatoms or like single-celled organisms that can tell you how salty the water was or what the temperature of it was, what vegetation was growing in an area. And then, okay, if it's these trees, that's a warmer climate than if it's these trees. So when you combine the two, or also Little Ice Age in general is not just limited to New Netherland, it's very much a Northern Atlantic phenomenon, but broadly in the Northern Hemisphere, and people's recording volcanic eruptions or how many sunspots are visible can tell you a bit about, you know, based on today, like, okay, if we had a volcano of that magnitude, this happens. So if it happened then, maybe this happened as well. So combining the two together is a good way to try to understand what went on in the past. But as a single person, it's difficult or impossible to have the expertise to really integrate all of that. So working in teams is good, but I do have a background in using some proxy records. So I've lucked out a bit being able to integrate that. Like, for example, Piermont Marsh and Tivoli Bay on the Hudson River, they have good sediment records that show a transition in the years leading up to New Netherland between warm, dry species and cooler, wetter species. There's a network of tree rings from the Hudson River watershed that includes timbers from Huguenot Street in New Paltz, looking at drought history for New York City. And so, for example, like the 1960s was the strongest drought in the area of the past 500 years. And the 1660s were the second most dry years.
Oh, wow.
There's tree rings. So some areas of the world have better coverage than others, but what was New Netherland has actually, I think, pretty good records on both sides, written and proxy.
Yeah, I mean, that's so important. And, it must be difficult to bring together the scattered references in the documentary record with, this other kind of record. So it's so important to have someone who is skilled in both.
It's really frustrating. I mean, our trees in the Northeast are just not as long lived as some in the West. So the records don't.
Right. You can't just look at a giant redwood or whatever.
Right. Your record like stops at 1750. And I'm like, you couldn't live 100 more years.
Yeah, I never thought about that before. Trees don't live, I guess, as long here as in some places.
Yeah.
So in what ways did climate affect the colonists in New Netherland on either a day-to-day level or in the kind of level of, extraordinary events, disasters? And was there any difference in New Netherland? Obviously this, but for our audience, New Netherland kind of stretched from Connecticut up to Albany, New Amsterdam, and then down to the Delaware River. So there's some different, probably climactic micro areas within there. So did that, where you were in New Netherland, affect how, what climate events you felt?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, as a person from the Albany area, it's interesting to see the difference in weather, like New York City versus Albany, or even Boston can have a blizzard and nothing happens in Albany. So you're right that it covered a wide area and you wouldn't have the exact same thing happening everywhere at once. But the record keeping is not consistent in all those places either. So I can't really draw a conclusion necessarily. I mean, Delaware warmer. People did talk about Delaware being warmer. Any farther south, get down to the Virginias or Maryland, that would be unhealthy because it's too warm and too not healthy for Europeans. Let me think. There were some events where there was one late 1650s, for example, Delaware through New Amsterdam up the Hudson Valley were really, really wet, lots and lots of rain. So whatever was happening was pretty broad scale. Tree ring records, you can look at drought and pluvial or wet conditions across that wider area as well. And in fact, like 1658, 59 were horrible on the Delaware. I would not want to have been living there at that time. And the Esopus region, which is near what is now Kingston, really, really wet at the same time. And Rensselaerswyck up the Hudson River also commenting on it being really, really wet. So again, you could have something that's affecting every place at once, but that might be the only time where the evidence is that strong for happening.
And so what happened in that situation where it was, so wet in 1658?
The harvest was bad. Also, it went into the 1660s, early 1660s, and like the Second Esopus War, the soldiers were just reined in. And actually that year, it was really, really wet fall, like 5 feet of water flooding the crops kind of situation, followed by a really hard winter, really snowy, and they didn't have like socks or shoes. So they couldn't pursue the Esopus people who they were fighting with because they didn't have socks or shoes in the winter. Interesting. And there are other examples of the military, of West India Company being unprepared with clothing for sure. And then because of all that snowpack, there was a huge runoff event in the spring and it was flooded again. So that would have been a pretty bad time. The harvests were bad for 3 years in a row. Same thing on the Delaware. They just could not get a foothold in what's now Newcastle because it was so wet. And there was disease as well. But of course, the higher ups blamed it on the settlers being lazy, unskilled, drunk. and
Yes, classic, classic back and forth in colonial records of which person is to blame for the disaster.
Yeah.
So just to get to my last question, just kind of to close before we get to some questions from the audience. So what, on a broad level, would you say that settlers did do in response to climate and weather?
Very difficult to say. There were, again, like flooding on Manhattan. There was a big storm that affected Manhattan, Albany, and the Delaware all at the same time also. And also same thing like 1655, 56, it was a bad winter and people were tearing down fences and palisades to burn. So that is pretty dramatic, but I think that winter was short in New England. So it may have just been like bad, but not long duration. And so there were rules like, okay, it's illegal to do that, or to prevent erosion on these streams in Manhattan, everybody has to plank the sides of their lot to raise the level of the, but people in both cases like just ignored that, those top-down directives. But there really was not a whole lot of, hey, we recognize every spring there are massive flooding events on the upper Hudson, so let's move all of the buildings uphill. It just repeatedly would happen. And some of the events were very traumatizing. People would talk about them 20 years later about the destruction and how many animals died. But the things that I do read are like, well, there's not much to do in the winter, so that's when everyone will go to school. Or
so winter maybe wasn't, in some ways, wasn't so bad, or it offers some different opportunities.
Yeah, the ground's frozen. It's a great time to go into wetlands to harvest wood, the time to chop wood, skating, sleighing, and horse racing on the frozen river was a really popular pastime. So there were things people did like, oh, I'm going to learn the Psalms this winter in the cold evenings. But there were also so many references to what a great harvest, what a great summer. The temperature this year is great. And days of proclamation of Thanksgiving and prayer and fasting for everything being great. So there's plenty of that. It just doesn't get written down because nothing happened, even though that's when pretty much like everything happened, getting established as a colony, but it's not recorded. Yeah.
I'm going to get to some questions from our audience. There's a question, is there any evidence of animal adaptation to the Little Ice Age? So for example, did anyone remark that animal pelts were thicker or more plentiful, or did those remarks stay pretty much the same over time?
There's a lot on the beaver trade, a lot of complaints when it's really bad, but an acknowledgement that the winter is the best time to get the pelts because that's when they're the thickest. But no trends over time that I noticed. I mean, it's a really short window.
We are talking about 1620 to 1664, basically. Yeah,
short window. But there is a small article, and I can't remember the name, where the author essentially argues, Little Ice Age, people are cold in Europe. They want beaver pelts, beaver felted hats and coats, which fueled colonization of the Americas, which then fueled harvesting of beaver so kind of
that kind of an argument that the coldness in the Netherlands itself kind of fueled this this colonization effort. Oh. Yeah,
it was an interesting take. I can't remember all the details, but it was kind of like a chicken or the egg sort of thing with beaver pelts. But no, I mean, there's different rating systems for the quality of a pelt, but I don't know if any trend that people have noticed. It's hard to even estimate the number of pelts that were being exported any given year.
And there's another question about fishing specifically. So do they remark at all about what they expected to find in terms of fishing and then what they found, and did climate affect fishing?
Sea surface temperatures were cooler in the Northeast at the time, so that would have an effect on fish where they are. nothing about what was expected, but certainly, again, in these like, come to New Netherland, it's so great, you know, talking about the massive schools of fish and how piles and piles of oysters that are a foot across, you know, so there's a lot of, there was abundance, but I don't know that people like expected there to be abundance or anything like that, no. Fishing, I always, when I'm reading these documents, I'm looking for references to the natural environment, and there's very little, because again, the types of records that they are primarily like government level, municipality level, and they, unless somebody's suing somebody for access to a pasture or you're keeping my livestock from me, they often don't make the cut.
There's another question about sources, which is, have you been able to look at any literature, paintings, art, drawings, etc., that give you any insights into this? 'Cause, I mean, I know we don't really have, unfortunately, too much art from New Netherland in this period, but
no, none that I can think of except for maps. You can consider those to be art for sure. But they might reflect land use, but not anything to do with climate. And I haven't seen any maps that refer to anything that would hint at weather or climate. You're lucky to even have a little description of what sort of vegetation might be in the area. Yeah, it's pretty lacking, which is where the proxies come in. And it would be nice to see some more like really finely detailed studies done. A lot of proxy records are used for like big time climate change, or like what was it like at the end of the last ice age, and so getting down to a year of resolution is not that important, even though it's possible to get really finely scaled information. It's just not, I suppose, useful to people who are experts in interpreting them.
yeah, I mean, of course, and it's a shame because obviously there's so many paintings in the Netherlands itself, of people doing wintry activities that I know historians have used there, but we don't have those same that same quality of images for New Netherland itself. So we'll have just one last question. Someone has asked, they're interested about your book that you're working on about climate in New Netherland, and kind of to talk a little bit about that current project and what you're working on.
Yeah, the climate history project, I would hope, would be first a paper, and then working on this book. Like, I have a lot of material for my dissertation that's about land use, land cover. Again, I jotted down anything that has to do with wildlife, minerals. Was the West Indian Company interested in mining at all? Yet there's some references to that. Making salt in Curacao, and I think there might have been a thought to try to do that in New Netherland. I'd have to take a look again, but I'm trying to think how are people interacting with the natural environment? They weren't just there making a Dutch Reformed church. They had to walk to the church through, snow, rain, whatever. There's records of people being excused from court because the weather is bad or they can't cross the river that day. And so, very much being from upstate New York and experiencing things now, going to feed your goats at 6 o'clock in the morning when it's winter time and everything is frozen. And people were living like that every day. And I'd like to paint a bigger picture of the everyday, like, lived experience of people interacting with their surroundings.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great point, that we're all now, even, obviously our day-to-day is affected by what's going on outside our windows, and it was the same for them, if not more so. So we're really excited to hear more about how that book goes, and we'll be sure to update everyone. So I think we're going to stop here. I just want to give you a brief reminder that we will be meeting again on May 25th, and our guest will be Levada Nahon, who works for the New York State Parks and Recreation Department and is an expert on foodways in New Netherlands. So please come join us again on May 25th. Thank you so much, Chelsea. This was a great discussion, and we'll see you all soon.